Welcome to the Air Force Doctrine podcast. I'm Dave Lally, your host. Here at the LeMay Center, we have a good background and understanding of the key questions and enduring concepts that we write into Doctrine. But we're also very aware that we're not the ones out there on the leading edge. We're airmen, and our joint coalition partners are working hard to create new combat capabilities in increasingly challenging environments. So we're always looking for fresh, motivated people who can help us keep pace with the speed of change based on what they're seeing themselves in their places in the field, in the staffs, or even in our own schools. So with us today, we've got the top 3 winners of our most recent Inspiring Doctrinal Innovation Essay Contest to discuss their proposals in person. The essay prompt this cycle was, the Air Force is adopting in-place combat wings, deployable combat wings, and combat generation wings as units of action, and it's implementing an air staff or A-staff structure within each wing's command layer. Write an essay on how the Air Force can effectively organize, train, and equip wing commanders and their A-staff personnel for distributed control of air power operations. Underneath that main prompt, we had 4 sub-prompts. What authorities and capabilities are required to allow commanders and A-staffs at these echelons to establish and conduct distributed control and fight within their area of responsibility? How, if at all, will the composition and authorities of the A-staffs be structured differently between the 3 types of wing missions? What are the necessary command relationships between units of action and the Air Force Force's service component and functional air component commanders? And finally, what doctrinal, operational, command support, and command and control changes will be needed to support this new construct? So with us today, I've got husband and wife team, the paper Preparing the Air Force's Maneuver Elements, Speed and Flexibility in a New Conflict Environment. It's Major Mary Belviso, who's the intelligence officer currently working at the LeMay Center as the branch chief of the A-Staff Development Course. We get good ideas from inside too. And with her husband, Major Tony Belviso, who's a CV-22 weapons officer and evaluator pilot currently attending Air Command and Staff College. A great thing about having folks there is we get some great spouse teams sometimes who are complementing each other as one's going through school, one is working with us. So we're really happy to have both of you at Maxwell. Next one is Master Sergeant Nunny Langius, who's the Section Chief, Command and Support and Staff at NATO AWACS Operations Squadron. Also a PhD, wrote the paper Transforming the United States Air Force, Adapting Organizational Structure and Distributed Air Power for Great Power Competition. And our winner was Staff Sergeant Joshua Paoleo. He's a radar evaluator for the 84th Radar Evaluation Squadron at Halo Air Force Base, Utah. He wrote the paper Lessons Learned, Futures Forged, Adapting Air Force Strategy for the Multi-Domain Era. So, and what I liked about the 3 things is you all hit slightly different angles, but you all gave us a potential piece for building out what right now we're working on as we develop the AF4 Gen and develop our deployable combat wings and units of action. And we have to also state up front that these papers were submitted before the recent changes to our big 3, the Air Force Doctrine pubs for operations, planning, and command and control. So as we said, we read these, we listen to what you guys say. Some of these things get in, some of them didn't. So what we will talk about is, did we get some of this right? Did some of your inputs help to maybe push us in the right direction? And did we go far enough based on the way you framed the problem and the changes that you suggested? Is there more we can do? And is there other things we need to change, whether it's in the realm of doctrine, joint, or Air Force doctrine? Is it policy or is it a force design challenge? And then the great thing with podcasts is we can send those as links to the people who are working on those. So again, thank you, all of you, for joining us, both for coming basically along with us on the doctrine contest itself, but now joining us all 3 from many different time zones to talk to us about this today. We talked about all of you somehow heard the call to join this contest. I'll start with Mary Tony. What inspired you to enter the contest? What was itching? What drove you to pick this specific topic?
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having us on the podcast today. So from my perspective, I currently work at the A-Staff Development Course. That course was specifically modified from the former JTF Staff Basic Course late last year to fit the needs of the Air Force's newly established Air Task Forces, which is basically the pathfinding unit for the deployable combat wings. And really, at the time, we were identified as one of the first training items that those Air Task Forces would receive. And we didn't have a lot of guidance to go off of what they really needed. We were getting a lot of questions from these ATFs of what their training plan should look like and really what they were going to be expected to do once they got into theater. And like I said, we didn't have a lot to go off of other than the Chief of Staff of the Air Force intent of what these units of action would look like, sister service doctrine and TTPs, and at the time, draft Air Force doctrine. That's where my true inspiration came from. How were we going to train these units of action today, not 10, 15 years down the line when concepts like ACE were perfected and we actually tested and operationalized doctrinal concepts like distributed control. At the same time, my husband, Tony Belviso, was in the PACAF elective at Air Command and Staff College. I'll turn it over to him how I got him roped into this whole thing.
Yeah, so certainly I was looking at some stuff for PACAF that's along these similar lines. What the contest allowed us to do, though, is get a little bit off the reservation, things that might not be as politically reasonable to ask for, and allow us to use this academic opportunity to kind of explore the space a little bit. And that's the way we used it. Additionally, her and I were deployed as the J2 and J3 of a Special Operations Task Group, which was the AFSOC's version of kind of pathfinding DCWs in a way. So we had relevant direct experience kind of operating in this environment and trying to figure out what it looks like for the future. So we thought we could wrap all that up into a paper and have a little fun with it.
It's fantastic. And I love how you mentioned like this is, and that's what we also look at as the chance, especially when you get to come to Air University for residence educational experience, the chance to get off the reservation, to think, to reflect, but especially to reflect on experience that you both have. That's exactly as it should be. So I'm heartened to hear that. So here's the tough part. So between the two, like and this has literally happened to me a couple times in my career, you end up on an elevator for 2 minutes going from the first floor to the 5th floor with a senior leader, and you have a chance to hit them, or you have 2 minutes with the chief to get something you've been working on. We'll let you pick who gives it, but what would your 2-minute elevator pitch for your paper be to that senior leader? It could be General Spain, it could be General Alvin, but whoever it is, can you give me a 2-minute elevator pitch of the core? This is what our paper's about. This is the problem that's bothering us, and this is what the solution is.
Sure. So the Air Force's current command and control model, it worked well for the past 30 years. The Air Force does a great job at deliberately task organizing around the Air Operations Center, which is the service's primary mechanism to execute C2 of Air Forces. The Air Force implements air power through an incredibly thorough process that synchronizes air planning and direction of air operations, tasking ISR and targets to air assets via the Air Tasking Order, or ATO. However, this takes time, really 72 hours to be exact. This presents two main issues. First, the ATO process impedes flexibility. It prevents commanders from effectively exercising mission command, and the process relies on a model that prioritizes air power in support of a ground campaign in an often uncontested environment. In any future major combat operation, the current structure would be too slow to respond to a rapidly changing environment. It also doesn't allow commanders really below the echelon of CFAC or JFAC to be empowered to execute air operations if comms were separate from the AOC. And that's where the concept of having the Air Force service retain assets comes into play. I'll pass it off to Tony for the other part.
Yeah, Air Force Doctrine right now, has one general officer that's COMAFOR and JFAC with the AOC running that operations. We believe that bifurcating those two roles, allowing the COMAFOR to retain some amount of assets, similar to the way the Navy and Marines kind of retain some of their air forces and only give a portion over to the JFAC for take on. That allows the COMAFOR to have some ability to execute independent air power outside of things that the JFAC is doing and potentially outpace the ATO.
All right. So what I hear you saying is we have issues with kind of supporting relationships. Which commanders have initiative and the ability to kind of take their unique perspective? When we talk about operating under a CFAC or a JFAC, either combined or the Joint Forces Air Component Commander, we're talking about basically functional components. These are organized by the geographic domain, but we have forces from multiple services underneath this, where the COMAFOR is the Commander of Air Force Forces. Basically, it's the blue chain on the Air Force chain of command. And in both cases, both are warfighters, but it's a different construct. So what I hear you saying is that under the current way we organize with the CFAC, and in either case, normally the COMAFOR is the CFAC. The COMAFOR always comes with an Air Operations Center. Sometimes we put a C on there, it becomes the KOC, but it's the same thing. That's a capability that the COMAFOR brings. And it's a question of how much is coming from that blue Air Force perspective versus that purple CFAC perspective. Does that change how the staff works? Because the same commander owns that operations center and the Air Force side of the staff, a lot of times they're blending those roles. You're calling for a little more of a separation of that, kind of a more independent air effort. I can see a benefit in that. And what you're saying is that air is not always a supporting force. It is sometimes the supported. And apportionment, which is the how many basically weight of effort of assets going to any mission, is generally a joint force commander decision. We do basically set up the decisions at the AOC, but it's the joint force commander. So in this case, you'll have both of these commanders that you would separate, having basically two Air Force commanders, one who's blue, Air Force forces, one who's kind of purple, integrating other forces, including air assets that have been given by coalition or joint partners, both reporting to the joint force commander. How would you reconcile some of the tensions there as far as when two or three are gathered, one must be in charge? If you're the joint force commander, do you listen to one boss more than the other?
I think there's already a method in place for this, as you've seen with other services. And I don't want to take away from what the CFAC or JFAC would be doing, right? There's so many additional hats that they would be wearing, ACA, AADC, all those kind of additional duties. All those things still need to happen, as well as coordinating for not kind of theater retained assets or inter-theater assets. So there's a lot in this scenario that the JFAC and AOC will continue to have to do and produce. All we're arguing for is to take some subset of that and retain them for a COMAF or to execute independent air power operations off of. So that is not to say that when things come up, certain mission sets in which they need assets, they couldn't still apportion for a smaller amount of time to take on over to the JFAC to execute a specific mission set and then take back their forces to do other things. The idea here is not to break up unity of command, but rather to allow for unity of effort in more kind of individualized sections to outpace potentially the massive arm that is the AOC.
So what it also sounds like is this might be more applicable to those operations that don't require all that. When you talk about like the 72-hour ATO cycle, we can always respond much more quickly than that. But what that usually is about is setting the theater logistics. Coming from a CFAC perspective, if you're going to, in 3 days, move from, let's say you're in CENTCOM and you have several fights going at once, you may need time to physically steam the aircraft carrier from one Gulf to another in order to support those operations and to have enough tanker gas to get everything there and back and all that stuff. So usually what that is, but what sounds like what you're talking about would be definitely more applicable to cases where the logistics were less tightly coupled and the air commanders basically working under these units of action had more capability to take care of things themselves with their local logistics, with their local armaments, with their local ability to command and control. Does that check with what you guys are kind of optimizing this for?
Yeah, and we addressed that a little bit in the paper, that some of the things, exquisite munitions, magazine depth, all of those things make this difficult to do. So you have to put some things in place to, not kind of overextend yourself in those areas.
Okay. No, appreciate that. We did the Doctrine contest before, and then we dropped new versions of the Big Three with Operations Planning and C2. I don't know if you had a chance to see those, but hey, did we capture some of the stuff that you guys were looking for in that? I don't think we haven't got the bifurcated COMAF4 and CFAC, but the other stuff, basically, did you get a chance to check them out? And then how do we do, what do we need to do more with?
We did. And I think the definitions are sufficient. That actually describes some of the conditions that need to be set in place in order to enable these units of action. So specifically the definitions when you go over centralized command, distributed control, what that means, really what we're seeing now is there's going to need to be a huge culture change in the Air Force in order to implement some of the changes that we described in our paper. And some of these things like conditions-based authorities, while we talk about them and they've been captured in Doctrine, we need to now see this executed and operationalized, especially those authorities that are usually retained up at the JFAC or CFAC, seeing that distributed down to either an Air Expeditionary Task Force or down to these deployable combat wings. We don't know what that looks like yet, but it will be interesting to see as we move forward.
I think 3.0.1 does a good job of identifying the problem, or at least addressing that those are things that need to happen, but we don't see in there a mechanism by which to execute it. We talk about MTOs, and then AFTP 5.0, I wasn't able to see a lot of difference between that and JPP. There's probably some nuance in there that I'm not picking up on, but this idea of order generation and operating off of orders is, kind of foreign to the Air Force. We're doing a lot right now to try to get better at that, both writing and reading orders and understanding commander intent. But those things will all play into an ability for subordinate echelon commanders to execute off of intent rather than wait for someone to tell them what to do. So we're for all of that. What we don't see, though, is the training mechanism to execute off that. And really, there's some inertia behind it that in order to push down those authorities, you have to be able to assume the risk appropriate for that and have the capability to see to it those lower echelons. And until we train and set up for that, I don't know that it's going to play out.
I agree with that. We're still figuring this out. I think this is definitely the challenge that General Cropsey is dealing with too with ABMS, to be able to do these kind of distributed operations, but also when and as we need to be able to still tie into that larger theater command and control to give commanders flexibility to set. And we tried to, I think, deliberately in the Doctrine to avoid putting any absolutes. We're still very heavily dependent on basically commanders' decisions and experience and good airmanship, basically good multi-capable airmen looking at the situation, taking smart actions. But you make a good point is, there's the trust in authorities and to make sure that they have that good guidance and the ability to plan locally. You make a good point is fundamentally any of the service's own planning processes are going to look a lot like the joint planning process, and for good reason, because the same basic steps are in place. What I think we were trying to offer with this is to give airmen a joint planning process that was something they could use that wasn't the whole joint air tasking cycle with everything that's usually entailed with that. So it's something you could use in at unit level, steps that any JOPS planner would be familiar with, but then to not have all of the other normal things you would normally worry about at a theater air level headquarters, and to give you some templates to basically, example, modified 5-paragraph order, the knee boards ideas. But I think you nailed something really important. Did I hear you say basically that the culture is the hardest change?
Yes, that's correct.
I think our last chief agreed when General Brown was, even before he was the chief of staff of the Air Force, he was pushing really hard for these doctrine changes. I never heard him say it himself, but as I looked at this, like what made the most sense is, especially where you're pushing the accelerate, change, or lose, was the idea that we're going to have to basically shift culture in order to be fast. And I'm hearing this in basically a lot of the same thing, I think, with the new administration and the guidance that we initially got, is this blends very well with what we're being asked to do and the new basically imperatives and the ability to stay current and to be innovative and to basically very rapidly, design that lethal warfighting capability with the forces we have under increasingly contested conditions, as we're seeing in our current conflict. So, hey, thanks so much, and thanks. Congratulations again. Yeah.
To add to that too, it's not just Air Force culture, but joint force culture, right? Air Force is an OT&E headquarters. That's what the Air Force does. They don't fight the war. So you also have to change the joint force commander imperative to how they're going to execute air operations and understand how that's going to work. So it's not just, I guess, Air Force culture that's the inertia there. It's the joint force as well.
Good point. All right, thanks. All right, Yenny, you're up. Let's talk about your paper. And same questions for you. What inspired you to enter the contest, and how did you choose your specific topic?
Hello, thank you so much for hosting this essay competition and for having me in the podcast. I was inspired to write this paper because I really found the topic to be intriguing and fascinating. Also, I saw it as an opportunity for me to dive deeper into what the Air Force is evolving in the strategic level, because to be honest, working as an enlisted member at the tactical level sometimes is very, very difficult to understand what is the strategy at upper echelon. So it was for me a medium to understand what it is in the development stages. Also, I was thinking that the shift we are seeing right now towards in-place combat wings, deployable combat wings, and combat generation wings is one of the most transformative changes currently in Air Force history. It was very intriguing to me. So I really wanted to understand what that meant, not just on paper, but also in terms of how it's going to play this change, this alignment into a real world operations and long-term policy. So I believe that new construct of cohesive units of actions is the core foundation of this transformation. It challenges traditional thinking and empowers commanders to make decisions at the tactical level. That kind of decentralization, especially in contested environments, is going to be crucial for future conflicts. At least that's what I think. It was what inspired to me to do more research on that. I wanted to explore how this concept works, how it's being implemented, and what it needs to be addressed. What are the gaps? So While this new shift offers huge strategic benefits, there are real challenges, especially when it comes to funding. Funding is one of the most vital things that we need to look into, an organizational alignment, because sometimes changing and restructuring organizations, it can be very difficult. I believe that by prioritizing critical capabilities, proper budget allocations, and optimizing how our force is structured, we can actually make this framework work. This research gave me the chance to think through those ideas and propose ways to help turn my vision into reality, maybe. Also, more than anything, I wanted to contribute something to something meaningful to help bridge the gap between high-level strategy and day-to-day execution. I believe that with sustained budget allocation, on-time, real-world training, development, and smart planning, this transformation can make our Air Force stronger, more agile, and more resilient for years to come.
All right, thank you. One of the things I like is you really focused on structure. And I like also that you gave us basically conceptual with your 4 basic pillars for distributed control. As a concepts guy, I'm always like, hey, give me a way to look at how these things fit together in that bigger picture. There's a neat book by Safi Bacall called Lewd Shots, but he also has another saying. He's talking about basically building innovative organizations and trying to get the structure right. It's a riff off, I think, the Peter Drucker quote. If culture, as we talked about in the last talk, if culture eats strategy for breakfast, then structure eats culture for lunch. So I like that you're going after what should our structure be and how do we look at not only just the warfighting things, but funding, how we organize, train, and equip. So thanks for giving us that perspective. If you had 2 minutes to pitch, and which boss would you pitch to on the air staff? Because that does sound like the level of discussions. Who could I get your pitch to if you could pick one Air Force leader, and I'll let you give it.
Well, for me, it's very difficult to answer that question. I don't have an answer for that name-wise.
We'll get them in the elevator later. The right person is in the elevator now. What would you tell them in for 2 minutes?
Okay, here we go. Sir, I believe if we want to maintain our strategic edge, we just need to transform. And that's why I think the Air Force depends mostly on our strategy, built around 4 key pillars. Number 1, how we develop and generate readiness. Advancing how we advance capabilities to project power. How we strengthen our partnership to expand strategic depth, and institutionalizing agility to adapt and innovate. Sir, I believe that our people are the foundation, and readiness today isn't just about physical assets. It's about preparing airmen to think, to lead, and to act decisively in a degraded multi-domain environments. That's why I think we need to double down on realistic scenario-based that empowers decentralized decision-making, especially for our commanders and A staffs. I believe when it comes to projecting power, the most important thing it is that we cannot wait. I think we need to aggressively invest in systems like air battle management systems, AI-enabled ISR, and hypersonic capabilities, to name the few, so we can just make our adversaries but outpace them. Projecting power isn't just about reach anymore. It is about speed, integration, and real-time decision dominance. I also think that we need to lean even harder in our partnerships, whether that's a NATO, Indo-Pacific allies, or industry. Nowadays, no single nation wins this kind of fight alone. Above all, I believe agility is more than a buzzword. We need to embed it in our culture, from the way we fund innovations and how to make the right decisions. As General Alvin said, with the pace of change of both the adversary and technology, we can no longer afford to move slowly. In the end, I think this transformation is about more than concept or doctrine. It is about preparing our force that is ready to act, ready to lead, and ready to win, no matter how the fight changes.
Thank you. I think you're in the elevator with the chief of staff and hopefully with Major General Kunkel as they both look at how your framework might apply to how we would describe the one force design that they've been talking about, which also, as we've been saying, this matches up a lot with the recent presidential executive orders and the initial guidance we're getting from SecDef. So thank you. That was a great thing. And the last thing, the design side, any doctrine documents we need to update to get that? Because to me, that looks like that's Air Force and that fits into joint. That'll eventually work it down into some of the specifics we'll have in doctrine. But any immediate doctrine changes that you would want to make in Air Force doctrine?
Yes, I honestly believe that if the Air Force wants to succeed in this new era of multi-domain warfare, we need to make sure our doctrine actually matches the pace and complexity of what we are asking people to do. Right now, we got a bold, forward-thinking strategy, but if our foundational guidance doesn't reflect the same urgency, we are going to keep running into gaps between what we say and what we want to do in what actually happens in execution. First, I believe the Air Force Doctrine Publication 3-0 operations really needs a refresh. It should go beyond high-level ideas and clearly spell out how decentralized decision-making, modular mission planning, and agile combat employment are supposed to work in real time. Commanders need to know exactly how to make autonomous calls when communication is disrupted, for example. That kind of clarity is what gives people and leaders the confidence to act when it matters the most. Second, I believe 3-0.1 command and control needs to break down how authority works in a distributed environment. I think it should explain how mission command applies across different wing types. For example, what's the difference in place, deployable, and combat generation wings, and how their A staff can operate with real independence. These teams have different missions and tempos, and they need guidance that is tailored to their specific operational needs. But it's not just about operations, it's also about combat support. I think we need to evolve our doctrine to allow more scalable, modular logistics. I think of like the Army's combat support brigades, small, adaptive, and it can get the job done even in contested environments. This needs to be also addressed with the joint doctrine, especially with JP 4-0 and JP 3-30. So we are not caught flat-footed when it comes to resupply and sustainment under pressure. We already seen what it can go wrong during Operation Inherent Resolve. Delays in getting supplies to forward operating bases created major risks for mission success. That was a real-world example of what happens when doctrine doesn't support operational reality. As we continue to modernize our command and control systems like the air battle management systems and distributed C2 nodes, we have to make sure that the doctrine supports those as well. At the end of the day, this whole transformation from operations to logistics to decision-making has to be grounded in clear command relationships. We need to define how wings, service component commanders, and functional air component commanders interact and support one another. Because without that kind of doctrinal clarity, even the best strategies can break down. It can be very damaging.
That is wonderfully specific and also very rich. I think a lot of the things we're still figuring this out with the new constructs, which is why we've been doing exercises like Bamboo Eagle. And then we've got the big Roof 4 pack coming this summer. And we're going to very specifically also have the great thing about the LeMay Center is we got Air Force lessons learned right in house. So they're going to be looking at those, collecting. As we figure some of these things out in the field, I think you hit on some great topic areas. And as we get more specificity on what is working and what is further needed, we'll be able to move those both into the doctrine documents and also into the TTP manuals that are even more specific. We'll have to come up with very specific procedures and recommendations for different areas, as each theater is going to have different challenges. But that's a great wrap up. Last question I ask, what do you think the biggest challenge to implementing the changes you suggested is right now? You've already had culture. Are you going to double down on that, or do you see another big challenge as a structure?
To be honest, I think maybe 5-4 and 3.0.1 are related to operations. They need important updates because they need to recognize the realities of distributed operations. But in my opinion, they still, after the review that has been done and has been published, they still fall short in what I was expressing or what I wrote in my essay. Maybe what I can say about adaptive planning in dynamic environments needs something mission type oriented and operational flexibility alignment. That's what I think in general. Definitely the updates is a step into the right direction, but I feel that the practical application of distributed planning, especially in environments where command nodes may be degraded or dispersed, isn't fully developed. We need more detailed guidance on how planning cycles functions under distributed control and how commanders and A staffs at different wings can independently generate and execute operational plans in alignment with a broader strategic vision, and also in real world scenario where those gaps could create delays and disconnects in execution. I guess until then, we are relying heavily on individual commander initiative and interpretation, which both the strength and the capabilities are at risk. I believe refining these documents with clear role-specific guidance, planning templates, and C2 diagrams maybe tailored to distributed environments will go along in ways to help us turn a strategy into executable action across the force. That's what I believe and I think.
Thank you. Yeah, we will continue to update these, and we'll continue to seek more of that specificity that you're calling for. So all good with that. And thank you so much for putting all of that together and giving us so many different things to think about. Our contest winner, Joshua, you gave us more specific things specifically for how our A staffs should be put together. So the same questions for you. Again, congratulations for winning the contest. What inspired you to enter, and how did you pick your specific topic?
Yeah, so I was definitely not going to submit anything to this contest originally. I saw it on the Air Force portal, and I just kind of scoffed off as like, oh, it's not really my thing. But the more I kind of thought about it, the more I related my experiences to the doctrine level, I realized that there was a responsibility to kind of speak into it. We talk a lot in the Air Force about readiness, capability, lethality. But one thing we don't really talk about enough is how people think, how they process pressure, how we train them to thrive, not just survive in the chaos of modern operations. That's really what inspired me to do it, to kind of step up to this. I've seen both sides of the training equation. I've seen the technical proficiency that we kind of hammer into our people, and I've seen what happens when someone hits a wall, not because they didn't know what to do, but because they weren't mentally ready to handle the situation. This paper was my way of kind of bridging that gap. It's more about bringing together the tactical operations with the psychological concepts that continue to evolve today. I chose the psychology of training because I believe to be real growth where that happens. Frankly, because I think the future of the military effectiveness hinges on how well we develop not just our systems, but our people. I was especially drawn to it after really reflecting on some of my own hard-won lessons. I've had the 2 a.m. phone call having to deal with someone breaking down because of the stress that they've gone through. I've been the NCOIC of several exercises where I was in a foreign nation where I didn't speak the language, and I'm trying to figure out how I'm supposed to communicate the certain needs that we have. With frustration building up among multiple cultures, it can really wear you down. The contest was really just an opportunity for me to write about this. It was a challenge for me to rethink how we do things, and it provided the perfect prompt for it with this catalyst type change that we're going through right now.
Now, great stuff. We talked about the structure, but all, these staffs, the way we put together structure is really how we manage kind of collective cognition. How do we try to build well-thinking teams who can bring together the skills of many different people and then take guidance and basically find ways to plan, to execute, to get the mission done? But it is, like you said, it's about the people more than anything else. John Boyd, one of the famous Air Force innovators, Air University Press recently published some of his thoughts that he used to talk about. I think it was people, ideas, and hardware, people first. That's where you start. And how do you basically prepare those? Give them a good structure and a good staff. It's still about how does that staff interact? How do we think? How do we make sense of the situation? How do we make good decisions? And really, the three entries, the three winners actually hit different parts of this connected problem very well. So it's pretty nice. We didn't plan it that way. It just worked out that way. And I can tell you, this is definitely for you. So I'm glad you listened to that little voice in your head and wrote, because this is so important. Like, you can have great ideas individually, but they help us get it out when you write. And now when you write, you can also get it out in podcast. So thanks again for writing. So again, same question as the others. If you had a 2-minute elevator pitch with the senior leader of your choice, what would that be? And what problem would you describe? And what would you want them to do for you? What would the ask be for them to do something to make things better?
I don't really have a specific leader in mind. Just a general prompt, I guess, would be, if we're serious about preparing for the next fight, then we need to fundamentally rethink and reframe how we train for this new fight. We have largely focused on the coin concept, counterinsurgency, winning hearts and minds and everything, but now we're moving to a peer adversary where their capabilities are much more advanced. And right now, our training systems are largely task-oriented, checklist-driven, focused on technical proficiency. And while that's important, it's only part of the picture. The future operating environment is going to be fast, ambiguous, and, as the previous people said, decentralized. Our airmen won't always have time to check for the TO or wait for top-down guidance. They'll have to make decisions on the fly, under pressure, in conditions that we can't fully script or simulate. And that's not a technical challenge, it's a cognitive and psychological one, in my eyes. We need to shift training from compliance and repetition to training for adaptability, resilience, sound decision-making. That means building in elements of psychological fidelity, replicating stress, ambiguity, and real-world complexity and scenarios into every level of training. We also need to treat emotional intelligence, cognitive load management, mental agility as warfighting competencies, not just side thoughts or side things that we kind of do on a CBT training. This isn't about making training easier, it's about making it more real. It starts with leveraging everything we know from psychology, learning theory, neuroscience to build a force that we can have think individually and thrive cooperatively in chaos and not just execute in a calm environment. If we get this right, we'll create airmen who aren't just technically proficient, but psychologically prepared, mentally agile, and decisively lethal in the face of complexity. That's the force our doctrine demands, and that's the competitive edge our adversaries can't easily replicate.
I like it. I would get you in front of General Robinson, Area Education Training Command, our boss, a couple levels up there. And maybe also General Bartolome, because I think his folks at the 711th Human Performance Wing would also be interested in that as we look at how do we get that right piece of, how do we kind of create the systems, the processes, the doctrine that is fully witting of and takes advantage of our cognitive bandwidth. It's not an official doctrinal term. If not, we should probably put it in there. But that is, you're right. It's so huge. It's like, I was recently contributing to the AI Doctrine that just came out. And one of the things that as we were studying, that's like, we're not really close to computers who can do all of that sense making for us and to basically apply judgment and experience and all these things to come up with solutions in the face of, like you said, complexity and ambiguity. So I am completely with you on that. So I think that's something that, we're still looking at putting an Airman Development Command. It's still tentative. We'll see where the new bosses take us there, but these are the kind of things I would definitely want them thinking about. So no, great stuff. Back to the note, we did publish some updates on this one. I don't think we even have any doctrine that fully fleshes out all that stuff, but any doctrine changes in what we currently had that you would suggest, and where would you put that content? You suggested some very specific recommendations for A staff composition. We got some things like that too. Do we need to change anything we put? Is there someplace that would fit under the units of action or the A staffs for the deployed combat wings? I think we did both agree on the chief of staff and how you run that A staff, but how would you work that into the design of our A staffs?
I wasn't able to look over the AFDP 3-0.1 until yesterday, 5-0 for planning. But off of a quick glance, I believe it read really well. Specifically, I loved the C2 process. Somebody had touched on it earlier. It provides a framework for the lower echelons on the tactical level to be able to implement these types of changes and be able to work. It provides them something to work with. More specifically, like the C2 process, Appendix B providing the considerations, providing clear guidance, and it asks the right questions, provides answers that people are able to, okay, I can follow this instruction. This is what I can do in this type of scenario. It keeps it broad, keeps it open. It doesn't reveal too much, but it keeps it open to that dynamic environment, provides a solid guideline. For the AFDP 5-0, the planning, I actually really liked this one, just off of a quick glance, the planning process, and in particular, the courses of action concept that you guys had implemented. It's in-depth and it provides a solid framework for, okay, if for this level, this is what I need to take care of. And then furthermore, like you go down into your Appendix B and the center in the different methods that you provide, you not only provide the advantages and how to implement, but you also provide the disadvantages and scenarios that it might not be the most effective method. So right off the bat, I do think that the new doctrine provides a solid new framework. I'd have to look a little bit more into it as far as further analysis. But yeah, no, as far as tailoring the A staffs, my goal was to provide what Yenyi was saying earlier, a modular perspective, being able to interwork these different wings, working with different missions, but being able to work seamlessly together. And my big thing was making sure that as these different wings are working on different missions, preparing commanders and A staffs for operations together, or for exercises like Red Flag, where it can kind of integrate these concepts. So, okay, well, if the combat generation wing isn't able to conduct their mission because communications are cut off, what can we do as the deployable combat wing? I really, as far as changes go, I think that it really incorporates those types.
I'm glad we got at least a decent start towards some of the structures and some of the supporting materials that will help you to give airmen a good, solid framework that then enables them to start from common areas and then empower that creativity, empower that knowledge and experience that you were talking about. We appreciate that feedback. So of the changes that basically to be able to incorporate the things, what do you think the biggest challenge to implementing the change that we would need to overcome? Is there one thing you'd change to kind of unleash kind of the cognitive renaissance within these staffs?
I believe it's doubling down on what Mary and Tony had said. It's a culture change. It's going to take a lot of pull to be able to change the way we train, the way we think. When we're talking about these types of changes, sometimes we've had to have Congress step in, like NSC 68, right after World War II, when Russia, they were able to detonate an atomic bomb. We were like, okay, we're not the only ones with the big stick anymore. We need to adjust our strategy. We need to change our culture. We can no longer sit idly by. We need to be more aggressive in our military operations. The same goes for after, I believe it was Desert Eagle and the Goldwater-Nichols Act of, I believe it's 1986, bringing together that jointness and, really it's those types of culture changes that, sometimes take an act of Congress, but, I think if we're able to make that change ourselves, we'll be in a much better position to accomplish the Air Force goals that we got in place right now.
Great point. I like that you referred to the other paper here. Things like this podcast are a small, but hopefully steady driver of that cultural change. But yeah, we're going to need help, basically, like you said, right after Operation Eagle Claw and the challenges, highlighting the culture and the structural changes we need in the Joint Force, eventually leading to Goldwater-Nichols. There might be some more of that. And obviously the Air Force is suggesting some changes that the new administration are looking at and Congress would have to approve. So you're right. It's that larger, it's the culture change internally, but also communicating to our leaders, hey, bosses, we heard what you told us we need to do. We've got your guidance. To accomplish that guidance, we may need some help with legislation. We may need some help with reorganization, and we may need some help at the joint level with how we organize to really unleash what we're trying to build for these distributed operations that can continue to give us that warfighting edge as we run into increasingly difficult, contested environments. What you said matches very well with what General Alvin's talking about and how what we're working on matches up with what SecDef's talking about now. So that's a nice tie. So again, all of you, thank you so much. You don't have to write You don't have to join up and take all this time, but we're really glad you do because, as I said, some of what you wrote probably influenced what was in the latest Doctrine updates, and some of what you gave us today, now recorded and transcribed, will help us to think about the next versions. And also, this will go into discussions I have with planners and leaders. And so that subtle influence may work, but no kidding. Thanks for giving us solid written stuff that we can pass around. And it becomes like a conceptual cruise missile, and this is what I want, hopefully you'll be able to do too, is as you meet people who have pieces of those problems or the ability to overcome some of those challenges, send them your paper, send them this podcast, and I'll do the same. Again, thank you so much, all of you, for coming together. I'll leave you with any parting shots or any last advice you would want to give before we close out today.
I have some last words.
Sure.
I think it's good to continue with the process. Also, there is a need maybe to build stronger feedback loops between Doctrine developers and the field, mostly because the best ideas come from those who work close to the mission, as we need to get more faster, more agile way to collect lessons learned for strategy, for policy, mission sets. I think that is important. Also, I believe that the future of the Air Force depends on the right alignment of strategy, doctrine, training, technology, and those needs to be rounded up in realities of right now multi-domain contested environments or warfare, as we say. If we can do that, I think we can empower our people with clarity, flexibility, and providing them the right tools. I think we will not only be ready for the next fight, I think we will be ready to lead it. That's my final thoughts and departing words. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanni. I really appreciate that.
We can jump into just two things I heard from the discussion today that I wanted to hit on. Is first, we can't be overly prescriptive with Doctrine. While Doctrine is just best practices, I think we all know and understand that people just follow it almost blindly. So being overly prescriptive will remove flexibility from commanders. So we don't want to force their hands. We want to give commanders the room to maneuver in whatever space we give them. So I just want us to, specifically as we continue to write Doctrine that goes down this land of mission command, to not be overly prescriptive. I did want to mention that in reviewing AFDP 5.0, I think the COA comparison chapter to that leaves a lot to be desired. That's an area where it's one of the most important factors when executing JPP or what we now call AFPP. And we did not do a great job of explaining that to people and expanding upon that. So in the next rewrite, there's plenty of people that probably have thoughts on that. But yeah, I think that section needs to be expanded and explained better so that people can actually execute on it.
All right. Going once, going twice. Again, thank you so much for your passion to join us, to write us. Congratulations on being the winners. And thanks again for joining us today so you could further expand on that. The written papers are great, but it's not like the dialogue we had today. So much appreciated. There's a lot I have that I can take to my networks and the other Doctrine writers and our lessons learned folks and our warfighting education folks. We're really happy to have you today. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, congratulations, winners of the Doctrine contest. Until we do again, Dave Weil signing off from the Doctrine Center.